Today we'll be talking about Chapter 16, Section 1, and it's called Science and Urban Life. We're going to be talking about advances in science and technology and how these help solve many of the problems in big cities, including overcrowding. But first off,
America, 1900. Horses lined the main streets of every town and city in the country. Cars were still a curiosity. There were less than 150 miles paved roads in America. Trucks and buses hadn't even been invented. But the world was changing fast, and most Americans looked forward to the future, to the 20th century. The mood was confident, so was the music, especially the marches of John Philip Sousa. In 1900, Sousa and his band were invited to the World's Fair in Paris, a grand exposition to celebrate the new century. Sousa's music was becoming known around the world as the music of America. The moving picture camera was new, and these short scenes taken in Paris that summer were among the first motion pictures ever made. People were fascinated just to see things move. The Eiffel Tower, built in 1889, was the symbol of Paris by 1900. To many, it also seemed a symbol of the future, with even greater wonders ahead in the 20th century. It was the tallest man-made structure in the world, and thousands rode the elevator to the top to see the world from a new perspective.
so one of the first neat technologies we get to talk about is skyscrapers. I mean, you can see some smaller versions of skyscrapers even by going to Asheville, but you really need to go to a big city if you've never been to see those really tall ones, 40 and 50 stories tall. See Atlanta, see New York, go to Chicago, go to some of these huge, huge cities with millions of people. And the concern all throughout American history is how do you cram so many people into such a small space? Brick and mortar buildings are limited in how tall you can build them. And with more and more people crowding into cities and places becoming ever more cramped, architects learned how to build upward. Steel was the key element that made this possible. Internal steel skeletons. Also, elevators. Our new building's going to be pretty sweet. You're going to be going up the stairs every day. There will be an elevator, however, for those of you who don't want to go upstairs every day. And that's only a two-story building. Yeah, that's only a two-story building. Imagine 30 flights of stairs. No one wants to go up and down that every day. It's not practical for the ordinary workforce. So elevators made skyscrapers practical. The first skyscraper was designed by an architect named Louis Sullivan, who built the Wainwright Building. Really, skyscrapers solved the problem, particularly in big cities, of limited and extremely expensive space. Because if you are going to invest that much money in downtown real estate, you want the best return on your investment. One of the coolest early skyscrapers is still around today. It's called the Flatiron Building. It's in New York. It's right on the corner of 5th Avenue and Park Avenue, if I remember correctly. I took a selfie there. I need to put that into it. But anyway, I've only been there once. I've seen it. It's really cool. Let me show you a picture of it, though. That's the Flatiron Building. You've probably seen it in a lot of movies. I think it's in one of the Spider-Man movies. But anyway, this is, if I remember, Times Square is way on down the street over this way. But yeah, this is the corner of Park Avenue maybe, and that's 5th. I can't remember. There's like a subway right here. Anyway, I'm not an architect, but I think one of the really neat things about this is that the designer was able to make use of this very limited space at the corner of the street and design one of the more famous skyscrapers. But another problem that technology was able to solve, transportation. See, before the Civil War, large cities relied on horse-drawn streetcars. Some of these could travel on iron rails, and that could speed up things. Many of them, however, were simply wagons. But by 1900, and I know this sounds crazy, there were electric trolleys, electric cars in 1900. Now, they traveled along fixed lines, and I'll show you a picture of one in just a moment. But these allowed people en masse, before automobiles were even available, to travel en masse along fixed routes and to commute from outside the city in. Some cities, even as early as 1900, had elevated trains or subways going underneath the city. Because the concern is, if you have a city like New York, which even at that time hosted 2 million people who all needed to get to work and all needed a place to live and all traveled back and forth every day, that's a historic amount of congestion. And all of these people want to be able to live outside the city where it's nice and quiet, but they want to be able to work in the city where the job opportunities are. And so you've got some major hurdles that technology has allowed us to overcome. Here's a photograph of a streetcar, a trolley, from 1900, an electric car in 1900. But of course it's traveling along a fixed route, and that little antenna is connecting it to a power cable which is above the car. Next, bridges. Most cities are built around rivers. And if we're going to be dealing with millions of people commuting on a daily basis, then we need to figure out how to get large amounts of people quickly and efficiently across rivers. And bridges have a tensile strength. If you want to go into engineering, civil engineering in particular, studies how much weight particular structures can support. And, I went to an engineering school, so this is what a lot of my friends do for a living now, is build bridges. And certain types of bridges can hold certain amounts of weight. And that can be studied and that can be predicted based on the materials used in the bridges. Now, John Roebling was a civil engineer who developed the very first steel suspension bridge. And for its time, this was a game changer, because a steel suspension bridge, and I'll show you a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge, which is the first of these major undertakings, can support much more weight. That means it can be a bigger bridge. That means it can be wider. That means you can get more people across much quicker. In fact, the Brooklyn Bridge is still in operation today. The one time I got to go to New York, I drove into Manhattan via Brooklyn Bridge. Still in operation today. Constructed in the late 1800s. But also, I think cities are exciting. I think you should go to several. My wife and I went to Denver this summer. It was really cool. We spent an evening there, went out to a nice dinner, walked around the city for a while. They were doing some kind of big cosplay event. It was cool. Everybody in the city was dressed up in costume, and it was fun. We spent an evening there. But then by the end of the evening, we were ready to go back to a quiet place, because we're country people. It was a little stressful for us. And when I went to New York, same experience. It was beautiful. I spent most of the time looking up at giant skyscrapers. It's an amazing experience. You've got to go. But I was also happy to find Central Park. You see, Central Park is right in the middle of downtown Manhattan, one of the busiest cities on the planet. But then you go to Central Park, and you can go for a nice run or walk. You can go sit by a lake. You can go read under a tree, and you can find a quiet, peaceful place in the middle of one of the crowdiest, busiest cities on the planet. And that's purposeful. In fact, Central Park was designed by a landscape architect called Frederick Law Olmsted. And he hoped that by building Central Park, this would give New Yorkers a sense of community, because there are constant community events going on in Central Park, and it would also give New Yorkers a place to relax. Because while the city is exciting, if you live there, then you're often thinking about where can you find a quiet, peaceful place. Because cities are, even today, with our environmental controls and technology, cities do still have an odd smell to them. Cities are still very noisy, and cities are certainly very crowded, and that can be stressful and anxiety-inducing for a lot of people. And so Central Park, designed in 1857, helped correct a lot of these concerns.
The Industrial Revolution gave rise to the rapid development of cities, where great concentrations of wealth and grinding poverty lived side by side, and where open space was disappearing rapidly. To counteract the ill effects of the Industrial Revolution, a novel idea emerged in the second half of the 19th century: public parks for the enjoyment of all Americans. One prominent Bostonian believed in the transforming power of open space. Frederick Law Olmsted, the great landscape architect and conservationist. His ideas became an inspiration behind the national park system. Olmsted once wrote, "We want a ground to which people may easily go after their day's work is done, and where they may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, and feeling nothing of the bustle and jar of the streets, where they shall, in effect, find the city put far away from them." He believed in the great democratizing power of parks, in their ability to bring all classes together. Olmsted's firm created endless designs for parks in cities and countryside, including Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., and Central Park in New York City. Olmsted's greatest legacy in Boston is the Emerald Necklace, a string of city parks running 6 miles from downtown Boston to Franklin Park in Dorchester. The concept of green space was never an easy sell, but Olmsted helped convince lawmakers and others that the creation of parks was a valuable social investment. With President Teddy Roosevelt's support, Olmsted's son carried on his father's legacy, helping to pen the Organic Act that established the National Park Service. The fundamental purpose is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Today, all of these national parks are preserved right here for all to enjoy, just as Frederick Law Olmsted would have wanted it. Their revolutionary ideas kept safe for future generations, so that you can experience your America. From the pristine seashores of Cape Cod to the Springfield Armory and John Adams' home, the National Park Service and its partners protect this Commonwealth's greatest cultural and natural legacies. And there are more than a dozen sites just within Boston to explore. Maritime adventurers, brave Minutemen, hard-working mill girls, visionary conservationists. So many have left their mark here. Most of them ordinary people with legacies far larger than themselves. That's a revolutionary idea, and perfect for Massachusetts. a land of revolutions.
So here's a photograph of Brooklyn Bridge. And this is one of the most famous and earliest steel suspension bridges. Well, of course, a steel suspension bridge relies on massive steel cables. I mean, these things are the size of a person. And these cables connect to these giant pylons. Pylons that go all the way, not only down to the bottom of the river, but deep underneath the ground. And they are the major load-bearing parts of the bridge. Well, these steel cables connect to each of the pylons, and then there's smaller cables that hold the bridge up. And that design is able to support a much greater amount of weight, meaning bigger bridge, meaning more people. That was a brilliant design, calculated using math, to be honest. Next, city planning. If you go to an old city, you know, maybe this spring or summer you're going to go with your family to Charleston. It's a beautiful place. Charleston was built prior to a lot of city planning. It was built prior to automobiles. And that's why when you walk down the streets, you're walking on cobblestone streets. It's beautiful. It gives you a quaint feeling of what life must have been like a long time ago. But also the streets are rather poorly conceptualized. They're not like a large city where you have long, straight avenues. No, it's more like lots of turns, narrow streets. They're not designed for lots of traffic. And so ideally, when you go to Charleston, park on the outside of the city and walk around. That's how it's designed, or that's what's intended today. But if we're going to deal with a modern concern of a growing city with millions of people, well, then we need to think about lots of traffic. And that's where city planning comes in. Daniel Burnham, another architect, drew a plan for a city with parks along Lake Michigan, and also was key in designing the great World's Fair in Chicago that I was telling you. Another exciting piece of technology. Cheap, massively produced paper. Now, Johannes Gutenberg, a German printer, changed the world forever when he developed a system of producing print quickly through movable type. But when paper became cheaper in the late 1800s through mass production techniques, more and more people could gain access to written works. And high-speed mills could produce cheap paper, and this faster production lowered the cost of paper, allowing more and more people to own more and more books. And this meant that more people could read. More people could access books. More people could read for pleasure. In fact, by 1890, the United States literacy rate reached the highest point it ever had in its history, and the highest point for any nation at that time. 90% of Americans could read and write. There are several reasons for this. You know, the growth of public schools at this time, the availability of cheap paper and books that go along with that, and also just a general improvement in the quality of life for many Americans. All right, and next, for you camera enthusiasts, photography. Before the 1880s, photography required professional equipment. You needed a stand, you needed a really clunky, very expensive device to take pictures. And so really only professionals and journalists were able to afford these cameras. However, when George Eastman introduced the Kodak camera in 1888, which was lightweight for its time, I know it's nothing like our cameras today, it was cheap relative to the cost of the professional cameras, and it was accessible to the average person. Now, I say cheap, but not really. In fact, it cost if memory serves, $80, which was a ton of money back then. And then it cost, I think, $30 to have the film developed and reloaded, because you would have to mail off the entire camera to the Kodak company. They would have to take the film out, develop it, they would mail it back, reload it with your pictures. Very expensive. So it was still considered a luxury to own a camera. However, this big innovation allowed more people to get into taking pictures. In fact, it helped create a whole field of photojournalism. From this point forward, I've got tons of pictures in a database to show you of just more stuff. We can begin looking at more pictures. Whereas when we were talking about the Civil War, I could talk about one photographer, Matthew Brady. Or moving forward, a handful of photographers like Jacob Riis, who photographed the urban poor. But there weren't many. But post-1888, there are tons of photographs because more people can start taking. Next, airplanes. Of course, we all know that the first flight was in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. But the two men who developed the first plane were bicycle mechanics who lived in Ohio. And the challenge had been for so long to develop a craft that could sustain flight. Now, gliders can fly for limited periods of time. Balloons had already solved the problem of remaining in the air. But the question and the challenge was how to sustain propulsion in the air over long periods of time. Well, the internal combustion engine was a relatively new concept. It was a form of propulsion that was light enough that could potentially, in theory, be placed on a craft supported by gliders that could sustain flight. Because no other engine had been this light before. I mean, think of a steam engine. Those things weigh a ton, literally tons. And you can't put one of those on a plane. The first successful flight, tested by Orville and Wilbur Wright, was in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, at the sand dunes. They used the sand dunes because of the high winds out there, and because if one of them crashed, they would hit a sand dune and they wouldn't die. So safety concerns, but also they needed the wind to support their craft. Of course, this wouldn't have been possible without the internal combustion engine. Now, check this out. In 1903, the first flight was demonstrated, and it was actually filmed, and we're going to watch a film of the very first flight. But within 17 years, planes were carrying the mail. Within 11 years, planes were being used in warfare, and there were even dogfights between pilots in war. So this is a game changer, obviously. But here's a little.
For centuries, people have dreamed of flying. But until just over 100 years ago, it was thought to be impossible. One of the first people to design a flying machine was an Italian artist and inventor named Leonardo da Vinci. In about 1500 AD, he drew up plans for a complex mechanism with wings that flapped like a bird's. He felt sure his device could carry a person into the air. The problem was, humans' muscles were too weak to move such large wings, and Da Vinci's airplane never worked. But in 1783, two Frenchmen did become the first ever to fly in a human-made device. They floated over Paris for more than 5 miles, that's 8 kilometers, in a large linen and paper balloon filled with hot air. Although balloons were the first aircraft that actually carried people, they were undependable because they only went where the wind carried them. In 1899, a Frenchman named Santos Dumont made an improvement to the balloon. He set one in a rigid frame, connected a bicycle chain to propellers, and pedaled his dirigible across Paris. But it would take the invention of an engine that was light enough and powerful enough before a practical airplane could actually carry people. During the 1880s, two bicycle makers from Dayton, Ohio believed a small gasoline engine designed for bicycles could also power an airplane. Orville and Wilbur Wright conducted many experiments, and in 1903 built a wooden glider, attached an engine to it, added two wooden propellers, and called their small craft the Flyer. On December 17th, they took it to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, an area known for its steady winds and high sand dunes. Orville Wright climbed into the pilot's seat, and the Flyer was launched into the air. Their flight only lasted about 12 seconds, but the Wright brothers made history that day by proving that an engine-driven, heavier-than-air machine could fly.
So within a few years, there were concepts for biplanes. In fact, this schematic was one of the first biplanes used in combat. The Germans even figured out how to attach a machine gun on the front behind the propeller, and we'll talk more about that later. But you know, airplanes obviously changed the world.